a limestone flake the size of your palm, pulled from the rubble of a village that has been dead for 3,000 years. Scratched into its surface in black ink, in the rushed cursive of a man who had other things to do that morning, are two lines. The first reads, Pendua, absent, reason, brewing beer. The second, Heneku, absent, his wife is bleeding. This is not mythology. This is not legend. This is a foreman's attendance sheet, one of more than 10,000 that survived in the dry heat of the Theban hills. And if you have ever called in sick to work, you are holding something in common with a man who lived 32 centuries before you were born. We have more documentation about the daily lives of these ancient Egyptian construction workers than we do about most medieval European peasants. We know what they ate. We know what they earned. We know the names of the men who showed up late, and the names of the men who didn't show up at all, and sometimes we know why. Because a scribe scratched the reason onto a piece of broken pottery and tossed it in a pile, and the desert kept it. This is the story of what a single day's wage actually bought a man who built monuments for eternity. Not the pharaoh's version of that story, the worker's version, written in his own hand. The village sits on the west bank of the Nile, tucked into a valley behind the Theban cliffs near modern Luxor. Its ancient name was Set-Mat, the place of truth. We call it Deir el-Medina. For roughly 500 years, from around 1500 to 1070 BCE, it housed the skilled artisans and laborers who cut and painted the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. These were not pyramid builders. The Great Pyramids at Giza are 1,000 years older, a gap in time as wide as the one between the Vikings and us. But the workers who left us the richest record of daily life in the ancient world lived here, in this walled rectangle of 70 mud brick houses arranged along a single street barely wide enough for two men to pass. Now, 1,000 years earlier at Giza, archaeologist Mark Lenner spent the better part of 2 decades excavating the settlement where the actual pyramid builders lived and ate and slept. And what he found in their trash heaps told a story that demolished the one you grew up with. The animal bones discarded behind the workers' barracks came disproportionately from young male cattle. Prime beef, choice cuts, slaughtered and butchered at a scale that implied organized state provisioning. Not table scraps. Not the refuse of enslaved men stealing what they could. The bones of well-fed workers eating better meat than most free Egyptians ever tasted. The pyramids were not built by slaves. Say it plainly, because the evidence is plain. Neither whips nor chains appear in the archaeological record of these sites. What appears instead is bread, beer, beef, linen, medical care, and a bureaucratic machinery so meticulous that we can reconstruct individual sick days across individual weeks of individual lives. So what did a day's wage look like? The answer requires you to forget money. Coinage did not exist in Egypt until the Greeks arrived after 332 BCE. For nearly 3,000 years of pharaonic civilization, workers were paid in things. The unit of account was the daben, about 91 grams of copper, used to calculate value the way you might use dollars on a price tag. But no one handed you copper. They handed you grain. A standard workman at Deir el-Medina during the Ramesside period received a monthly ration of 4 sacks of emmer wheat and 1.5 sacks of barley. Each sack held roughly 76 liters of grain. The wheat became bread. The barley became beer. Broken down across the working month, this translates to approximately 10 loaves of bread and a measure of beer per day, though the exact daily breakdown varied, and the figure is a scholarly generalization, not a single definitive receipt. 10 loaves of bread, 1 jug of beer. That sounds like poverty until you understand what bread and beer meant in this economy. Bread was not a side dish. It was the currency, the calorie, and the culture. And beer was not what you're imagining. Not amber, not clear, not cold. Egyptian beer was a thick, opaque, grain-flecked slurry, strained through woven baskets into wide-mouthed jars. Nutritionally, it was closer to liquid bread than to anything you have ever pulled from a refrigerator. Low in alcohol, high in calories, dense with B vitamins from the fermentation. When the state paid you in beer, it was not drugging you into compliance. It was feeding you twice. But the base ration was only the beginning. Delivery records from the village document periodic supplements arriving from state warehouses, fresh fish from the Nile, dried fish for storage, onions, garlic, leeks, cucumbers, dates, sesame oil, salt. On festival days, and there were many, meat and wine appeared. These weren't luxuries smuggled in. They were logged, itemized, and distributed by scribes whose records we can still read. What could a month's wages buy beyond food? This is where Jack Jansen's painstaking work with the Ramesside price records becomes extraordinary. A goat cost 1 to 3 Deben, a pig 3 to 5, a simple linen garment 5, a bed, wooden frame, woven cord support 12 to 25 Deben, a coffin, and in Egyptian culture, a coffin was not optional. It was the minimum equipment for eternity, 25 to 30 Deben. A donkey, the pickup truck of the ancient world, 20 to 30. A senior workman's monthly grain ration has been estimated at roughly 5.5 Deben in trade value. Not wealthy, but not destitute. Over months of careful saving, a worker could accumulate enough to buy a coffin, to own a donkey, to furnish a house. And many of them did more than save. They hustled. The ostraca record a private economy thriving in the margins of the state system. After spending their days cutting and painting the pharaoh's tomb, workers went home and made miniature coffins, carved shabti figurines, painted small stelae. All for private clients in neighboring communities who wanted afterlife equipment but lacked the skill to make their own. Some workers lent grain at interest. Others traded goods across the river. These were not men crushed beneath the wheel of an indifferent state. These were tradesmen with side businesses. If you want to understand where they slept, walk with me down that central street. The houses line both sides, sharing walls like row houses, mud brick on stone foundations, whitewashed inside with gypsum plaster. You duck through a low doorway. The average Egyptian man stood about 5'5", and enter the front room. A mud brick platform against one wall, perhaps a birthing bed, perhaps a household shrine. Through to the main room, a raised divan for sitting and sleeping, and set into the wall, a painted niche. There, in red ochre and Egyptian blue and carbon black, a small image of the cobra goddess Meretziger, protectress of the mountain that these men walked over every morning to reach the Valley of the Kings. 70 square meters. 4 or 5 rooms in sequence, ending in a roofless kitchen at the back where bread was baked and smoke could rise. A cellar cut into the bedrock for storing grain and valuables. A staircase to the roof, where the family slept on summer nights when the interior rooms became ovens. No running water, no well. Water came by donkey from the valley below, carried in ceramic jars by state-assigned water carriers whose deliveries were, yes, documented in the ostraca. Every drop accounted for. The workday began before dawn. The path from the village over the limestone ridge to the Valley of the Kings is still walkable today. 30 to 45 minutes of climbing in blinding white rock under a sky so blue it looks painted. Rest huts dot the route, roofless stone shelters where men paused in the heat. They worked an 8-day week with 2 days off, the Egyptian 10-day decade with its built-in weekend. 2 shifts per day, split by a midday break. And the absences. Those glorious, damning, deeply human absences. A worker named Amenemwia missed a day because he was embalming his mother. Another missed work because he was building his house. Another. And the scribe recorded this without comment, without judgment, with the flat indifference of bureaucracy, was absent because he had been drinking with Khonsu. Khonsu was not a god in this context. Khonsu was a colleague. The man was hungover, and nobody fired him. 3,000 years before labor law existed, Egyptian foremen documented that workers got drunk and missed their shift, and the system absorbed it and moved on. If you are sitting with the growing suspicion that these people were more like you than you were taught, hold that thought. Because in approximately 1170 BCE, in the 29th year of the reign of Rameses III, something happened in this village that will sound so modern it may unsettle you. The grain shipments stopped coming. Not for a day, not for a week. For 18 days, the workers received nothing. The state supply system, fraying under administrative corruption and Libyan border incursions, simply failed to deliver what was owed. And the workers did something no ancient laborer was supposed to be capable of doing. They walked off the job. They crossed the enclosure walls of the royal mortuary temples, government property, and sat down. The Turin strike papyrus, preserved today in the Museo Egizio in the Italian city of Turin, records their words to the administrators who came to negotiate. We have come here driven by hunger and thirst. We have no clothes, we have no oil, we have no fish, we have no vegetables. Send to Pharaoh our lord about it, and send to the vizier our superior. Act so that we may live. No violence, no weapons. A sit-down protest and a clear articulation of grievance directed through proper channels with specific demands. In 1170 BCE. It is the earliest documented labor strike in human history. The vizier. Ptah eventually intervened. Partial payments were made. The underlying supply problems were never fully resolved. The late Ramesside period was a time of slow institutional collapse. But the workers proved something that the record preserves. They understood their labor had value. They understood that rations owed were rations owed. And they understood that collective refusal was a tool available to them. If you have ever wondered whether ancient people conceived of something like workers' rights, not in the modern legal sense, but in the functional sense of enforceable expectations, this papyrus is your answer. Now I need to tell you how they died, because this is where the story becomes most human and most Egyptian. At Giza, the workers' cemetery revealed simple pit burials, bodies in contracted positions, a few beer jars and bread loaves placed alongside for the journey. One skeleton showed a forearm fracture, cleanly healed. Someone had set that bone. Someone had splintered it and waited for it to mend, and the man had gone back to work. The spine of another showed the compression damage of years carrying heavy loads. These bodies tell a double story. The work was brutal, and somebody cared enough to provide medical treatment. Both things are true. But at Deir el-Medina, the burial evidence tells a different story. These skilled artisans, the men who painted the walls of pharaohs' tombs with scenes of eternity, came home to their village and painted their own. Their tombs are small. Their tombs are not royal, but they are beautiful. The same hands that rendered Osiris on the walls of the Valley of the Kings rendered Osiris on the walls of their own burial chambers in the same pigments, with the same skill. They carved their own shaptis. They assembled their own funerary equipment. They prepared for their own eternities with the tools of their trade and the surplus of their wages. And they did it with a care that tells you everything about who they believed themselves to be. A disposable labor force does not paint its own afterlife. The women of this village are visible in the record in ways that would be impossible almost anywhere else in the ancient world for another 2,000 years. A woman at Deir el-Medina could own property. She could initiate divorce. She could testify before the village court. She could receive rations in her own name. We know this not from royal propaganda, but from the legal ostraca, the scratched-out proceedings of neighborhood disputes over inheritance, over donkeys, over accusations of adultery heard before a panel of the workers' peers. These are the textures of a complete community, not a labor camp. A village where people fell in love and wrote poetry about it. Your voice is pomegranate wine. I live by hearing it. And where they stole each other's tools, and where they buried their mothers, and where they got drunk on their days off and missed work, and a scribe wrote it down and tossed the record in a pile, and the desert held it for 32 centuries until we bent down and picked it up and read it. That is the thing about Egypt that popular culture consistently gets wrong. It is not mysterious because we cannot read it. It is staggering because we can. We can read their grocery lists. We can read their love notes. We can read the name of the man who was too hungover to show up on Tuesday. And against the silence that swallows most of human history, that specificity is not a footnote. It is the whole miracle. The village of Deir el-Medina sits empty now, its central street open to the sky, its mud brick walls eroded to shoulder height. The path over the mountain to the Valley of the Kings is still there. Tourists walk it sometimes without knowing that the same stones held the feet of men named Pendua and Heneku and Amenemwia, men who built eternity for pharaohs and then came home and built smaller eternities for themselves. If you have ever imagined that the ancient world was populated by faceless masses, people without names, without choices, without the stubborn human insistence on being recognized, these 10,000 ostraca are the correction. They are attendance sheets and shopping lists and love letters and legal complaints, and every single one of them says the same thing. I was here. I had a name. Write it down. The next time you pass a construction site, men in hard hats, a thermos of coffee, someone calling in sick, you are watching something that is 3,200 years old. The tools changed. The coffee replaced the beer. But the foreman still writes it down. And the desert, if we are lucky, still keeps it. If we are